The wheels of the heavy carriage groaned, sinking deeper into the icy Montana mud as Isabella strained against the frozen wood with everything she had. "Push, you useless girl!" Silas barked, his voice cutting sharper than the wind tearing across the open plain. Her lungs burned, her breath coming in ragged gasps, until finally, with one desperate heave, the carriage lurched free. As she stumbled forward, her frozen fingers brushed a small velvet box in the floorboards. Something wild and hopeful broke open inside her chest. "Silas, I found it! Yes! Yes, I'll marry you!" The tears came before she could stop them. But Silas looked down at her the way a man looks at something he scraped off his boot. "That ring is for a woman who doesn't crack the floorboards when she walks. I'd rather rot in this mud than marry a mail-order mistake like you." The whip cracked. The carriage disappeared into the dark. Isabella stood alone in the blizzard. No name, no promise, no ground beneath her feet. Then she saw it, a faint lantern glow bleeding through the storm, above the doors of a massive timber barn. She fell toward it, one numb step at a time, until the hay swallowed her whole. She had no idea whose barn she'd wandered into, or that the man who owned it was about to change both their lives forever. Stay until the very end, because the price Theodore Jones paid to protect this woman will leave you breathless. Take 2 seconds, subscribe now, and join our Frontier family.
He smelled the storm before he heard it. That particular Montana cold that carried iron in its teeth and promised nothing gentle before morning. Theodore Jones pulled his coat tighter and pushed open the barn doors with the flat of his palm, lantern swinging in his grip, fully expecting nothing more than restless horses and the quiet complaint of timber settling in the freeze. What he found instead stopped him where he stood. A woman, lying in the hay like she'd simply given up on the world and let it put her down. Her dress was the color of ash, worn through at the elbows, and her dark hair was spread loose around her face like something the storm had unraveled. She was full-figured and deeply, completely asleep. The kind of sleep that only comes after a body has been pushed past every limit it knows. One hand rested open near her cheek, as if she'd been reaching for something even as she fell under. Theodore stood over her for a long moment, jaw tight, lantern casting its gold light across her face. She was not what he expected. She was not, in fact, anything he had a category for. What in the... He stopped himself, looked toward the barn doors, looked back at her. The wind outside gave a long, low moan across the roofline, and the temperature inside the barn told him everything the storm was still planning to do before sunrise. He crouched down, studied her face with the detached assessment of a man who had built an empire by reading land, livestock, and leverage before committing to anything. Her lips were pale. There was a dried cut along her jaw, fresh, maybe a few hours old. Her boots were cracked straight through the sole on the left foot. She'd walked through that blizzard, in those boots. He straightened up, and that was the precise moment he heard the soft click of heeled shoes behind him. "Theodore." His mother's voice was quiet, but it had a way of filling a room regardless. Margaret Jones stood in the side doorway of the barn, a shawl drawn tight over her shoulders, her sharp eyes moving from her son to the woman in the hay, with the calm, unhurried attention of a woman who had seen enough of the world to know when something mattered. Theodore turned. "She was here when I came in. I don't know her." "No," his mother said, stepping closer. "But you can see her plain enough." He didn't answer that, Instead, he said, with the particular flatness he used for problems he had already decided to solve in the most efficient manner available. "She can't stay here. Come morning, I'll have one of the hands take her into town." Margaret looked at him with the expression she reserved for when he was being both practical and completely wrong at the same time. She knelt beside the sleeping woman with a steadiness that made Theodore feel suddenly young and clumsy, pressed 2 fingers gently to the woman's wrist, and was quiet for a moment. "Her pulse is steady. She's exhausted, not ill." She smoothed a loose strand of dark hair away from the woman's face with a tenderness that had no business being in a barn at this hour. "Someone put her in this storm, Theodore. Nobody walks into a Montana blizzard through a hole in their boot by choice." Theodore said nothing. He looked at the open hand resting in the hay, that small, surrendered gesture, and something moved in his chest that he immediately had no interest in examining. "One night," he said, finally, his voice harder than he intended, "she sleeps. Come daylight, she's gone." He turned and walked out of the barn, back into the dark and the driving cold, and told himself he had already forgotten her. But the image of her lying there, still and pale, and somehow unbroken, followed him all the way back to the house and sat down across from him at the fire, like it had nowhere else to be. The image of her stayed with him through breakfast, through the morning muster, through 2 hours of fence-line inspection he barely saw. By the time Theodore rode into the settlement of Gravel Creek to settle an account at the dry goods store, he had almost convinced himself that the woman in the barn had been some trick of lantern light in a long night. Then he heard the screaming. It came from the lower end of the main road where the creek had jumped its banks overnight, turning the wagon ruts into rivers of brown churning water. Half the settlement was already gathered at the edge of the surge, and Theodore pulled his horse up sharp, scanning the chaos with the trained eye of a man who had managed disasters on open land since he was 17 years old. He saw the child first. A boy, no older than 5, clinging to a fence post in the middle of the flood channel, the water already at his chest and climbing. The crowd on the bank was loud and frozen in the particular way crowds go frozen when fear outpaces courage. And then he saw Isabella. She was already in the water. She hadn't hesitated, that much was clear from the way she was moving. No wasted motion, no performance of bravery, just a woman who had seen something that needed doing and had done it before the thought fully formed. The current was vicious, and she was fighting it with everything she had, her worn dress dragging, her footing uncertain on the submerged ground, but she kept her eyes locked on the boy, and she did not stop. Theodore was off his horse before he made a conscious decision to move. He hit the water at the edge of the channel and pushed toward her, but she reached the boy first. She wrapped both arms around him, pulled him from the post, and turned back toward the bank, and it was only then that her legs gave. The current took her sideways, and Theodore caught her by the arm, hauling them both upright, the boy pressed between them, all 3 of them gasping and stumbling until the ground rose beneath their feet and the water released them onto the muddy bank. The crowd surged forward for the child. Nobody surged forward for Isabella. She stood with her hands on her knees, soaked through, chest heaving, mud to her elbows. When she finally looked up and saw Theodore standing over her, again in that same posture of bewildered authority, something flickered across her face that wasn't quite embarrassment and wasn't quite defiance. It was closer to exhaustion so complete it had burned through every pretense and left only the bare truth of her. "You," was all he said. "I didn't ask for your help," she said quietly, and her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "You were going under. I had him." Theodore looked at her for a long moment. The cut on her jaw from the night before had not been tended. Her left boot was still broken through at the sole, now soaked and ruined beyond any further argument. She was shivering in a way she was clearly trying to hide, her jaw set against it, her pride doing the work her body no longer could. He pulled his coat off and held it out. She looked at it the way people look at things they want badly, but have been taught not to reach for. "Don't make it a bigger moment than it is," he said flatly. "It's cold. Put it on." She put it on. He helped her onto his horse without asking permission, and she didn't protest, which told him more about how she was truly feeling than anything she would have admitted with words. They rode back toward the ranch in silence, the settlement falling away behind them, the great open Montana sky pressing down wide and pale above the mud. She had saved that boy without a second thought and asked nothing from the world in return. Theodore kept his eyes on the road and said nothing, but something in him had shifted, quiet and irreversible, like a floorboard settling in the dark.
Margaret Jones was waiting on the porch when they rode in. She took one look at Isabella, soaked, shivering, wrapped in her son's coat with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned to wear borrowed things without apology, and turned back through the front door without a word. By the time Theodore had seen to his horse, and Isabella had climbed down from the saddle on legs that only slightly betrayed her, there was a fire roaring in the kitchen hearth and a pot of something hot already talking on the stove. Theodore stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms folded and the particular expression of a man watching a situation develop in a direction he had not approved. "She needs dry clothes and a meal," his mother said, not looking at him. "And before you say a single word, Theodore Allen Jones, that child she pulled from the creek today was Hetty Marsh's boy. The whole settlement saw it. So whatever argument you've been rehearsing on the ride home, I'd reconsider its weight." Isabella sat at the long kitchen table and said nothing, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of hot water, her eyes moving carefully around the room, the way a person maps a space they're not sure they're allowed to occupy. Theodore said, "She can stay the night again, but this isn't a boarding house." Margaret set a bowl of broth in front of Isabella and finally looked at her son with the full, unhurried attention that had been straightening Theodore's spine since childhood. "Go see to your ledgers," she said quietly. "I'll come find you." He left. The kitchen exhaled. In the silence that followed, Isabella's eyes drifted to the bundle of dried herbs hanging above the window, gray and dusty, tied with twine that had begun to rot. She looked at the broth in front of her, tasted it carefully, set the spoon down, and looked at Margaret with a tentative honesty that was somehow more eloquent than confidence would have been. "Your yarrow is 3 seasons old, and there's no elderberry in your stores. If any of your ranch hands take a chest cold this winter, you'll lose a week of labor before you can treat it properly." Margaret went very still. Then she sat down across from Isabella and studied her the way she might study a piece of land she was newly considering. "Where did you learn that?" "My grandmother, and the crossing, and hunger." Isabella paused. "Hunger teaches you what grows and what heals if you pay attention long enough." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. By the end of it, Margaret had walked Isabella through every corner of the kitchen, the cold store, and the small infirmary room off the eastern hallway, and Isabella had identified 6 deficiencies, suggested 3 remedies available within a half-mile of the ranch's tree line, and, quietly, almost absently, reorganized the spice shelf in a way that made 40 years of accumulated chaos suddenly legible. Theodore received the news of his mother's decision the way he received most things he couldn't immediately control, in silence, with a jaw that did considerable work. "She stays on as cook and healer. I've offered her fair wages and the small room above the kitchen. Mother,
The Hands have been eating salt pork and regret since Mrs. Calloway left in September. You want to argue with me about that?" He didn't, but he made it known, through the particular quality of his silence, that he was not pleased. What Theodore could not articulate, because he was not yet a man practiced in articulating such things, was that his displeasure had very little to do with practicality. It had to do with the way the kitchen already smelled different, of warm broth and dried sage, and something that had no business being in a house that had run on iron and transaction for the better part of a decade. It smelled faintly and dangerously like a home. And Theodore Jones had spent a long time making sure this house was nothing of the sort.
It started with Hector's hand. The oldest ranch hand on the Jones property had been working through a split palm for the better part of a week, wrapping it each morning with a strip of feed sack and saying nothing, the way men who have never been tended to say nothing, not from toughness, but from the simple absence of expectation. Isabella saw it on her third day when he reached across the table for the bread, and without ceremony or fuss, she took his hand in both of hers, unwrapped the makeshift bandage, and examined the wound with the focused quiet of someone who knew exactly what she was looking at. She cleaned it with a poultice she'd prepared that morning from plantain leaf and rendered tallow, wrapped it properly, and told him to keep it dry for 2 days. Hector looked at his hand afterward the way a man looks at something he'd forgotten could be cared for. By the end of the week, she had treated a wrenched shoulder, 2 cases of the early rattling cough that preceded a chest infection, a burn from the forge, and a young hand named Clem who had been quietly suffering a grief he couldn't name since his brother had left for Oregon in the spring. She hadn't treated that one with herbs. She had simply sat with him at the edge of the water trough after supper and listened until he'd said everything he needed to say, and some things he hadn't known were in him. Word moved through the ranch the way water moves through dry ground, quietly, completely, in every direction at once. By the second week, the Hands took their meals with a different quality of ease. The long table, which had previously hosted the particular silence of men eating fast so they could get back to work, now hosted conversation, laughter occasionally. Hector had taken to leaving a small bunch of wildflowers at the kitchen door each morning, wordlessly, the way men offer gratitude when they have no language for it. Theodore noticed all of it. He said nothing. It was the night of the first hard frost that he came into the kitchen late, past 10, the house long quiet, still in his work clothes, trail dust on his collar, ledger tucked under his arm. He stopped in the doorway when he found Isabella at the table, a single lamp burning, mending a tear in one of the younger Hands' work shirts with the focused patience of someone who had long ago made peace with the late hours. She looked up. Neither of them spoke for a moment.
He moved to the stove with the careful economy of a man trying to take up as little space as possible in a room that had stopped being entirely his. He poured coffee, stood with his back to her, then turned and sat down at the far end of the table with his ledger open and said nothing, which was as close as Theodore Jones came to an invitation. Isabella went back to her mending. The fire settled. Outside, the frost was doing its slow, silent work across the fields he'd spent 15 years building into something his father had only dreamed of. "You don't sleep," she said eventually. Not an accusation, an observation. "The ranch doesn't sleep," he said, without looking up. "The ranch is asleep right now," she replied, with a gentleness that somehow failed to be impertinent. "You're the one who isn't." He looked at her then, really looked, the way he hadn't permitted himself since the barn. In the lamplight, she was composed and warm and entirely unbothered by his silence, which was something he could not say about most people who sat across a table from him. "You've done well with the men," he said finally. It came out stiffer than he intended. "They're good men," she said simply. "They just needed someone to act like it." The words landed somewhere unguarded in him and stayed there. He looked back at his ledger. The columns of figures swam for just a moment before he steadied them. All that land, all that capital, all that carefully constructed empire, and she had walked in with nothing and made the men who built it feel like they mattered in a fortnight. He closed the ledger quietly. For the first time in longer than he could honestly account for, the numbers felt very small.
The first sign of Amelia Blackwood's arrival was the dust. It came before the carriage, before the sound, before anything, a long, pale plume rising on the south road like a declaration. Isabella was in the kitchen garden, cutting the last of the late sage before the second frost took it, when she heard the hands go quiet, in that particular way men go quiet when something is coming that rearranges the order of things. She straightened up, shielded her eyes, and watched the black lacquered carriage roll through the ranch gates with the unhurried confidence of something that had never once considered it might not be welcome. Amelia Blackwood stepped down from the carriage, the way a woman steps onto a stage she has already decided is beneath her, but will perform upon regardless. She was slim and immaculately assembled, her green traveling dress without a single crease despite the road, her dark hair pinned in a style that belonged in a San Francisco parlor and knew it. She looked at the ranch with a proprietorial sweep of her eyes that took in the fences, the grazing land, the house, and, briefly, Isabella standing at the garden edge with soil on her hands and sage in her apron, with the same flat assessment. Her gaze passed over Isabella the way it passed over the fence posts, registering, categorizing, moving on. Theodore came off the porch to meet her, and something in the way he straightened his jacket told Isabella everything she needed to know about the weight this woman carried in his life. He was composed, as always, but it was a different quality of composure, tighter, more managed, the kind that costs something to maintain. Amelia kissed his cheek and said something close to his ear that made him nod once, slowly. Then she turned and looked at Isabella directly for the first time and smiled. It was a beautiful smile. It was also the coldest thing Isabella had encountered in Montana, which was considerable. "You must be the little charity case Mother Jones has taken in," Amelia said, her voice carrying the musical lightness of a woman who had learned to coot her cruelty in melody. "How resourceful of her, and how sweet that she found you something useful to do with your hands." Her eyes traveled the full length of Isabella with a leisurely patience designed to ensure nothing was missed and nothing was accidental. "I do hope the kitchen suits you. Some spaces are simply more accommodating than others." Isabella said nothing. She had learned in the years before Montana that silence was not always weakness. Sometimes it was the only dignified response to a person who was hoping to draw blood. But her hands tightened around the sage. In the days that followed, Amelia conducted her campaign the way a general conducts one, with patience, precision, and the strategic use of terrain. A comment about portion sizes at dinner, delivered with a solicitous concern that made it impossible to object to directly. A request made sweetly to Theodore that the kitchen girl perhaps not linger in the main rooms when guests were present. A remark about Isabella's dress, offered with the tilted head sympathy of a woman performing generosity, that sat in the room long after Amelia had left it. Theodore said nothing, and his silence, Isabella understood, was not cruelty. It was the silence of a man who owed Amelia Blackwood 40,000 acres of Blackwood land and the water rights that came with it, the deal that would secure his family's ranch against the northern land grabs for the next generation. She was not merely his fiancée, she was the architecture of his future. Isabella scrubbed the kitchen floor that night until her knees ached and told herself it didn't matter, that she had survived worse, that she was here for wages and a room and nothing more. She almost believed it.
If this story is already pulling at your heart, you are not alone, and it is only going to get deeper from here. Hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a single chapter. The best moments of this story are still ahead, and you do not want to find out you missed them. The celebration was Margaret's idea. She called it a harvest supper, which was a modest name for what became, by the evening of the third Saturday in October, the most populated event the Jones Ranch had hosted in 3 years. Lanterns were strung the length of the main barn. The hands had pushed the equipment back and laid down fresh hay, and someone had produced a fiddle and a squeeze box from somewhere. And by 7 o'clock, the warm light and the music were spilling out across the cold, dark yard like an argument against winter. Isabella had spent 2 days cooking for it. Bread and roasted meat and 4 kinds of preserved fruit and a venison stew that had the hands circling the kitchen door an hour before it was ready. She had told herself the work was the point. The work was always the point. And if she stayed close to the kitchen and the serving table, she would be useful and invisible in equal measure, which was exactly what the evening called for from her. Amelia had arrived in ivory silk. She moved through the gathered ranchers and their wives with the ease of a woman who understood that a room was a kind of currency and she had never once been poor. She laughed at the right moments and touched Theodore's arm at careful intervals and accepted compliments about her dress with a practiced modesty that fooled everyone who wasn't watching closely. Isabella watched closely, not from jealousy, she would not permit herself that, but from the particular alertness of a woman who has learned that beautiful things can carry poison just as readily as ugly ones. Theodore danced with Amelia when the fiddle started its first reel. He was a capable dancer in the way he was capable at most things, precise, controlled, correct. But there was no ease in him. His hand sat at her waist with the deliberate placement of a man following a form he had memorized rather than felt, and his eyes, more than once, did not stay where they were supposed to. The first time his gaze crossed the room and found her, Isabella looked away immediately. The second time, she wasn't quick enough. For just a moment, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, they looked at each other across the warm and crowded barn while the fiddle played, and Amelia said something near Theodore's ear, and the lantern light moved over everything like it was trying to be kind. Isabella felt it move through her like a current through still water, that look, quiet and deep and entirely inconvenient. She turned back to the serving table and busied her hands. One of the town women, a sharp-faced rancher's wife from the valley, paused beside her with a plate and looked her over with the unhurried rudeness of a person who has never had to develop discretion. "You're the Jones charity girl," she said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "Margaret's taken in strays before, but never quite so substantial a one." She moved on before Isabella could construct a response, which was probably the intention. Isabella kept her hands moving, bread onto plates, stew into bowls, the work, always the work, the reliable country of the work, where her worth was legible and her size was simply part of the woman doing the labor. But later, when the dancing had slowed and the guests had thickened into small, warm clusters of conversation, she slipped out through the side door and stood in the cold yard alone, the music reaching her in muffled waves through the barn wall. Above her, the Montana sky was unreasonable in its beauty, black and endless and crowded with stars that had no interest in any of the small human arrangements happening beneath them. She pressed her hand flat against the barn wall and felt the fiddle's vibration move through the timber and into her palm. She was falling for him. She knew it the way you know the first frost is coming, not from a single sign, but from everything in the air at once, and the quiet certainty that warmth, however real it had been, was about to become considerably harder to hold on to.
She should have known it was Amelia's idea from the way it was delivered. Too smooth, too considerate, wrapped in the kind of false warmth that only exists when someone wants something from you they know you wouldn't give freely. It came on a Tuesday morning through the ranch foreman, a heavyset man named Briggs, who delivered the message with the flat efficiency of someone passing along instructions he hadn't questioned. One of the men stationed at the Ridgeline shack had taken ill in the night, chest fever, possibly worse. The supply wagon needed to make the run before the weather turned. The regular hand was occupied with a lame horse. Would Isabella be willing, given her knowledge of medicines and the terrain she'd been learning these past weeks? Isabella had said yes before she finished hearing the question. She loaded the medicine chest herself, the elderberry tincture, the yarrow compresses, the fever powders she'd prepared and stored against exactly this kind of need, and climbed onto the wagon bench in the gray pre-dawn without ceremony. She did not see Amelia watching from the upper window of the house, still and composed as a portrait, one hand resting against the glass. She did not see Briggs receive a folded note from Amelia's maid, read it, and look away. The first hour of the drive was manageable. The road north was familiar enough, threading between the lower pastures before it began to climb, and the cold was the sharp, clean cold of early morning rather than anything threatening. Isabella kept the horses to a steady pace and let her mind go quiet in the way it did when she was moving and useful and the work was clear in front of her. It was when the road forked and she followed the marked direction, a strip of red cloth tied to a post that she had no reason to distrust, that everything began to change. The trail she turned onto was narrower than it should have been, the grade steeper. She felt it in the way the horses hesitated, their ears moving with the particular unease of animals that know something a person doesn't. She pressed on, telling herself the line shack was only another mile, that the clouds banking to the northwest were still distant, that the cold deepening around her was simply the elevation. Then the left wheel dropped. It didn't break, not at first. It gave, slowly, with a grinding shudder that traveled up through the bench and into her hands, and Isabella pulled the horses up hard and climbed down to look. The wheel's iron pin had been nearly withdrawn from its housing, not worn loose, not worked free by road and weather, but pulled deliberately most of the way out, leaving just enough purchase to survive the flat lower road and fail precisely here, on the mountain pass, 2 miles from anywhere. She stood in the wind and understood what had been done to her. The blizzard arrived with the particular indifference of Montana weather, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, as if a door had been opened somewhere to the north and everything behind it released. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the time it took her to unhitch the horses, and the snow came sideways, the kind that doesn't fall so much as attack, finding every gap in a coat, every exposed inch of skin, with a cold that was less a sensation than a verdict. She couldn't ride both horses and couldn't leave them. The wagon was useless. The trail behind her was already disappearing under white. She did what she had always done when the world removed every option but one. She moved. She took the horses by their leads, turned them against the wind as best she could, and walked. Her broken-soled boots, she had never been given new ones, never asked, filled with snow within minutes, and the cold began its slow, patient work on her feet, and then her hands, and then the edges of her thoughts. She was not ready to die in this mountain pass. She had not come across an ocean and survived Silas and found Margaret's kitchen and felt Theodore's gaze move through her like a current, just to be buried under Amelia Blackwood's vanity on an unmarked trail. She walked. The snow swallowed the world around her, and she walked.
She had stopped feeling her feet somewhere in the last half mile. That was the part that frightened her most, not the cold itself, which had become almost abstract, a fact of the world rather than a sensation, but the quiet disappearance of her body from her own awareness. First the feet, then the fingers, then the edges of her thinking, which had begun to soften and slow in a way that she recognized distantly as dangerous. She had made it to the ravine's lower shelf before her legs decided they were finished. She went down against the rock face with as much dignity as the situation allowed, pulling the horses close for what warmth their bodies offered, and told herself she was resting, only resting, that she would stand again in a moment and continue, and the trail would appear and she would find her way back the way she always had, through stubbornness and the refusal to accept what the world had decided for her. But the snow kept coming, and the cold kept deepening, and the moments stretched, and Isabella's last clear thought before the edges of everything began to blur was of the kitchen, Margaret's kitchen, with the fire going and the sage hanging above the window and the lamplight doing its warm, unhurried work across the table, where she had sat across from Theodore in the late quiet and felt for the first time and longer than she could measure, like a person who was exactly where she was supposed to be. She closed her eyes, just for a moment. She heard him before she saw him, the horses first, then his voice, cutting through the wind with a controlled urgency that was the closest Theodore Jones ever came to panic. Her name, in his mouth, in that blizzard, was the most bewildering thing she had ever heard. He said it like it mattered. He said it like losing her was not an acceptable outcome he was prepared to negotiate with. He came over the ravine's edge on foot, having left his horse above, and when he saw her against the rock face, his expression did something she had no framework for. It broke open, briefly and completely, before he locked it back down and covered the distance between them in seconds, dropping to his knees in the snow beside her. Isabella. His hands were on her face, her wrists, checking her the way she had checked Hector's hand that first week, with focused, urgent care. Stay awake. Look at me. She looked at him, snow on his shoulders, jaw set hard against whatever he was feeling, eyes doing all the work his face wouldn't permit. I'm resting, she said, and her voice came out strange and slow. You're not resting. You're freezing. He pulled her upright, wrapped his coat around her on top of her own, and held her against him with the straightforward determination of a man who has made a decision and is no longer interested in the cost. She felt the warmth of him move through the cold like the first light through a barn door, and something in her that had been bracing for a very long time, finally, helplessly, let go. He got her up the ravine. He got her onto his horse. He rode with her held against his chest, one arm around her, and said nothing for a long time, which was how she knew how frightened he had been. It was when the ranch lights appeared in the distance that he spoke. Briggs told me. His voice was low and even, but underneath it was something she had not heard from him before, a cold, quiet fury, and beneath that, something rawer still. The wheel, the trail marker, all of it. Isabella said nothing. She could have killed you. She intended to, Isabella said simply. His arm tightened around her. A long silence followed, filled with wind and the horse's steady movement, and the weight of everything that had been accumulating between them since the night she had fallen asleep in his hay. The Blackwood deal, she said quietly. Theodore. The land. Is land. He said. The two words carried the full weight of a man who had just watched everything he thought he was building reveal itself as the wrong thing entirely. It's just land. He stopped the horse at the ranch gate and turned her carefully so she was facing him, and in the darkness, with the snow still falling and the lights of the house burning behind him, he looked at her the way he had been refusing to look at her for weeks, completely. Without the managed distance, without the armor of ledgers and legacy and all that carefully constructed silence. I don't want the empire, he said. I have spent 15 years building something I thought would be enough, and it has never once felt like what you made this house feel like in a fortnight. His voice was steady, but it cost him. I want you, Isabella, if you'll have a man who took far too long to say so. The snow fell between them, soft and indifferent and quietly beautiful, and Isabella looked at him for a long moment. This hard, proud, lonely man who had taken her coat off in a blizzard and held her against the cold, and felt the last of the world's low opinion of her dissolve like frost in morning light. You took an unreasonably long time, she said. And for the first time since she had known him, Theodore Jones smiled. Fully. Openly. Like a man who had just been given back something he hadn't known he'd lost.
The reckoning with Amelia Blackwood was not loud.
That was the part nobody in the territory expected. They had anticipated a scene, the kind of operatic confrontation that frontier gossip is built on and retold across a decade of winter suppers. What they got instead was Theodore Jones walking into his own parlor the morning after the blizzard, with Isabella at his side, still pale from the cold but standing straight, and addressing Amelia with the quiet, final tone of a man who has already decided everything and is simply delivering the conclusion. He told her he knew what she had done. He told her the Blackwood land deal was finished. He told her the carriage would be ready within the hour and that he expected her to use it. Amelia looked at Isabella once, a long, assessing look that moved through several emotions before settling with some difficulty on something that was almost the beginning of understanding that she had miscalculated completely. Then she looked at Theodore, and whatever she saw in his face was enough. She laughed without a scene, which was, in its own way, the most surprising thing she had ever done. The door closed behind her, and the house breathed differently.
Margaret Jones appeared from the hallway with the expression of a woman who has been waiting a considerable amount of time for the world to arrange itself correctly, and is experiencing the particular satisfaction of having been right all along. She crossed the room, took Isabella's face in both her hands, the way she might have done with a daughter, and said nothing for a moment, because nothing was required. Then she said, "Welcome home, my dear." And that was the end of Isabella's long search for a place that would keep her. The weeks that followed were full of the quiet, purposeful work of a life being properly assembled. The Blackwood deal was replaced in time by a water rights agreement Theodore negotiated on his own terms. Harder won, smaller in acreage, but entirely his, which made it worth considerably more. The ranch hands, when the news of the engagement spread through the property, responded with the kind of unrestrained celebration that suggested they had seen it coming long before either of the principals had admitted it to themselves. Hector left a bunch of wildflowers at the kitchen door that morning that was twice the size of his usual offering. Silas was never spoken of. He did not need to be. The man who had left Isabella in a Montana blizzard and called her a mistake had simply become irrelevant, not through bitterness or reckoning, but through the far more complete erasure of being entirely replaced by a life he could not have imagined for her.
The wedding was held on the first clear Saturday in December in the yard of the Jones Ranch, with the mountains standing in the distance like witnesses that had been there long before any of the human arrangements and would remain long after. Isabella wore a dress Margaret had sewn from fabric ordered 3 weeks prior, deep blue wool with cream at the collar, and she walked across that frozen ground with the unhurried steadiness of a woman who had crossed an ocean, survived a blizzard, pulled a child from a flood, and scrubbed enough floors to know the precise and unassailable value of her own 2 hands. Theodore waited for her at the front of the gathered crowd, ranch hands and valley neighbors, and a few of the town women who had the good grace to look quietly ashamed of themselves. And when she reached him, his expression was the one she had come to know as his most honest, open, unguarded, slightly undone. He took her hands. The preacher said the words. The mountains kept their long, patient silence. And Isabella Jones, who had once been left in the snow and told she was a mistake, became the frontier queen of the most talked about ranch in Montana. Not because of the land, not because of the money, but because she had walked into a cold and hollow empire and filled it, simply and completely, with a soul it had always been missing. If this story moved you, if you stayed from that frozen barn all the way to this wedding, then you already know what this channel is about. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the next story is already coming, and it begins exactly where your heart is. Like this video so more people find their way to this frontier family. Drop a comment below and tell us which moment broke you open. Was it the barn, the blizzard, or the smile? And share this with someone who needs a story that proves the world is wrong about them. Every share brings another soul to the fire. We will see you in the next chapter.